Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive. This time, we're plunging into some pretty deep waters, figuratively speaking, of course. We're tackling Leviathan.
A fascinating choice and a popular one. We received a veritable treasure trove of listener material on this one.
We did articles, ancient texts, even a snippet of a podcast, if you can believe it.
Clearly, our listeners are ready to go beyond the typical portrayal of Leviathan as just a big, scary sea monster.
Exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're not just looking at Leviathan itself, but what all these different interpretations tell us about, well, us. Humanity's relationship with the unknown, the things that scare us, the things we can't control.
Absolutely. Leviathan becomes this canvas, you could say, for our deepest fears and fascinations. And the way each culture, each time period, chooses to paint that canvas, well, that speaks volumes.
Okay, so we've got a lot to unpack here. Let's start with the basics. We've got Hebrew, Jewish, Christian, even a fascinating take from the Church of Satan, of all things. Seems like everyone's got an opinion on this Leviathan character.
It's true. And each tradition brings its own flavor, its own anxieties to the myth. We see Leviathan depicted as this fearsome serpent, a dragon, even a fallen angel in some versions.
It's like this creature embodies the ultimate what if, Like what if there are these massive, powerful forces out there that we have absolutely no control over? It's both terrifying and exhilarating at the same time.
Exactly. And that's where those early depictions, especially in the Hebrew and Jewish traditions, get really interesting. They tap into this primal fear of the unknown, particularly the untamed vastness of the ocean.
Right. Like in that YouTube video you sent over, they talk about Leviathan being this monstrous serpent, but also God's celebratory feast, which I have to say is a pretty mixed message if you ask me. Why create something so magnificent just to devour it?
It's not quite as straightforward as a simple meal. That imagery, especially in the Jewish tradition, is less about a literal feast and more about showcasing God's power. Imagine for a moment a creature so colossal, so formidable, that even the divine chooses it for a feast of cosmic proportions.
Wow, okay, I see what you mean. It's like saying, look at this incredible, terrifying thing I created, and I have the power to consume it. Less about a picnic, more about flexing those divine muscles.
Precisely. And it gets even more interesting when you consider that in Jewish tradition, Leviathan wasn't alone. There's this whole other layer to the myth about Behemoth.
Ah, behemoth. Now, there's a name that sends shivers down your spine. I always pictured it as this colossal, land-dwelling counterpart to Leviathan.
You're exactly right. Behemoth is often depicted as this massive beast symbolizing the untamed wilderness, just like Leviathan embodies the raging sea. And according to some Jewish texts, these two, yeah, they were supposed to be mates.
Wait, really? Talk about a power couple. Though, knowing how these myths usually go, I'm guessing their honeymoon didn't last long.
You're catching on. God, seeing the potential for chaos that their offspring could unleash. Well, let's just say he took preemptive measures. It wasn't pretty.
So, no happily ever after for these two lovebirds. Ouch. But I guess that feeds into the whole theme of divine power and control we were talking about. God creates these incredible beings, these forces of nature, but then also sets boundaries, decides their ultimate fate.
Absolutely. And that act, that destruction of Behemoth, an eventual plan for Leviathan, sets the stage for a theme that really takes off in later interpretations. Resentment.
Right, because even if you're a mythical sea monster, being created for the sole purpose of someone else's dinner has got to sting a little.
And that's where the Christian interpretation takes a sharp turn. No more celebratory feasts here. Leviathan becomes this fallen angel consumed by envy, joining Lucifer's rebellion against heaven.
Talk about a fall from grace. It's like Leviathan went from the main course at God's banquet to public enemy number one.
It's a complete transformation. And it speaks to a very human fear. What happens when something powerful, something magnificent, turns away from the light? It's a cautionary tale about ambition, disobedience, the seductive allure of going against the grain.
Okay, so we've gone from God's banquet to angelic rebellion. Talk about intense. But then you've got this whole other perspective, this satanic viewpoint that flips the script completely. It's not even about good versus evil anymore, at least not in the traditional sense.
It's definitely a curveball, that's for sure. In the satanic lens, Leviathan isn't this terrifying monster at all. In fact, it's almost empowering.
Almost. From what I've read, they practically celebrate Leviathan. They see it as this symbol of creation, of knowledge, of embracing your own potential without being limited by dogma or anyone else's rules.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's about questioning, exploring, forging your own path, even if it goes against the grain. It suggests that maybe good and evil are far more complex than a simple binary.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, that's for sure. So we've got Leviathan as this multifaceted figure, interpreted and reinterpreted across cultures and time periods. But one thing's clear, it's not just about a big, scary monster. There are layers here, deeper meanings that tell us something about what it means to be human.
Precisely. And that's what makes these ancient myths so endlessly fascinating. They reflect our anxieties, our aspirations, our constant struggle to make sense of a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable.
It makes you wonder, if we were to encounter Leviathan today, out there in the depths of the ocean, how would we react? Would we see a monster to be feared or something else entirely?
That, my friend, is a question worth pondering. And perhaps the answer lies not out there in the vast unknown, but within ourselves.
So we're diving deep into the psyche of a mythical sea monster today, trying to figure out what makes Leviathan tick.
It's not as crazy as it sounds. These ancient myths, they weren't just campfire stories. They were a way for people to explore these really complex ideas, these primal forces that are still relevant today.
Right. We're talking about fear, ambition, the desire for knowledge, even something as, well, human as resentment.
And Leviathan, no matter how you interpret it, seems to be swimming in resentment, doesn't it?
Can you blame it? We were talking earlier about those early Jewish interpretations. Imagine being this colossal, awe-inspiring creature created for the sole purpose of becoming someone else's dinner.
Talk about a raw deal. It makes you wonder about free will, even for a creature like Leviathan. Did it have a choice in its fate? Or was it always destined to be, as you put it, the main course?
Food for thought, for sure. And some Jewish texts even suggest that Leviathan wasn't just meant to be eaten, it was actually a threat to God's order, like this force of nature even he couldn't fully control.
That's a really interesting point. It's not just about being a hungry monster. It's about this inherent power, this wildness that defies even the creator. No wonder God decided to step in.
Right, you can't have this embodiment of chaos running around ruining your whole carefully crafted creation. But then that brings up the question of why even create it in the first place? It's enough to give a mythical sea monster an existential crisis.
And maybe that's the point. This idea that even something as powerful as Leviathan is still bound by a predetermined fate. It's no wonder that resentment festers, that this creature might lash out against those limitations.
Which leads us to those later interpretations, right?
Yeah.
The Christian tradition really runs with this idea of Leviathan as a rebellious figure, a fallen angel, no less.
Cast out of heaven, consumed by envy and bitterness. Talk about a fall from grace. Leviathan becomes this symbol of divine punishment, a warning about what happens when you challenge the established order.
Which is so interesting when you compare it to the satanic viewpoint. They're all about challenging the status quo, but for them, it's not about destruction, it's about enlightenment.
It really highlights how subjective these concepts of good and evil can be, doesn't it? One tradition's monster is another one's symbol of liberation. It all depends on your perspective.
It's true. So we've got Leviathan driven by resentment, but also this thirst for knowledge, this desire to break free from the boxes we put it in. But what does it all mean for us? Why does any of this matter?
Because whether we realize it or not, we're still grappling with these same questions today. What does it mean to have free will? How do we confront the unknown? What happens when our desire for knowledge, for power, goes unchecked?
It's like that old saying, we fear what we don't understand. And Leviathan, well, it embodies that fear perfectly, doesn't it? This massive, unknowable creature lurking in the depths. It's a reminder that there are forces in the world far greater than ourselves.
Exactly. Forces we may never fully comprehend or control. And yet there's something about confronting that unknown, that sense of awe and terror that draws us in.
We can't resist a good mystery, even if it terrifies us. It's like we're hardwired to seek out these stories, these myths, as a way of trying to understand those bigger forces at play.
And maybe, just maybe, by exploring those stories, by looking into the eyes of a creature like Leviathan, we learn a little something about ourselves along the way.
That's a pretty good reason to be afraid of a mythical sea monster, if you ask me.
Yeah.
But before we get too existential here, I want to shift gears a bit. We've talked about Leviathan's origins, its motivations, but we haven't really touched on its impact.
And what an impact it's had. This is a creature that has infiltrated our art, our literature, even our everyday language. Leviathan's reach extends far beyond those ancient myths.
Okay then, let's reel in this behemoth of a topic and see what we can learn. So we've been on this deep dive with Leviathan, exploring its origins, its motivations, all those juicy details. But I'm really curious about this. How has this mythical beast left its mark? Not just in those ancient tales, but in our world, our art, even our language.
Well, let's just say Leviathan isn't content to just lurk in the depths of the ocean. Its influence, it pops up in some unexpected places.
That's what makes this whole thing so fascinating. It's not just some ancient legend gathering dust in a textbook somewhere.
It really isn't. Think about it. Even today, when we talk about something being a Leviathan, we're not just talking about a big fish, are we? We're talking about something massive, something that kind of looms over everything else.
It's true. A Leviathan corporation, a Leviathan task. It's like something that feels almost impossible to grasp, let alone control. Like those primal fears, those ancient anxieties about being dwarfed by something larger than ourselves, they're baked into our language.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it goes beyond just individual words. I mean, look at literature throughout history. Leviathan, in all its forms, it's a recurring character, a symbol of these larger-than-life forces that we can't ignore.
It's true. Like you can't talk about sea monsters in literature without mentioning Moby Dick.
Exactly. I was just thinking about Melville's masterpiece.
Yeah.
That giant white whale, it's not just a whale, is it? It's this symbol of obsession, of humanity's destructive potential, of the unyielding power of nature.
Right. It's like Moby Dick is our modern day Leviathan. And speaking of modern day, look at fantasy novels today. So many of them still feature these giant sea serpents, these krakens, these monstrous creatures lurking in the depths.
It's like a universal fear, isn't it? That idea of something massive and unknowable hidden beneath the waves.
And don't even get me started on those old maritime maps. You know, the ones with the illustrations of sea monsters and here be dragons scrawled across uncharted territory.
Oh, absolutely. Those maps are a perfect example of how those early explorers, they didn't just fear the unknown, they embraced it. They wove it into their art, their stories, their understanding of the world.
It's like they were saying, yeah, the world is full of terrifying creatures and we're going to put them on a map. It's both terrifying and kind of inspiring at the same time.
It is, and that sense of awe, that fear mixed with fascination, it translates beautifully into visual art, too. I
Yeah.
mean, have you ever seen some of those medieval and Renaissance paintings of Leviathan?
Oh man, those are something else. The detail, the sheer terror on the faces of those sailors as this massive creature rises up from the depth. You can practically smell the salt spray and hear the screams.
They're captivating, aren't they? But they're also incredibly insightful. Those artists, they were tapping into something very primal, very human, that fear of being swallowed whole by the abyss, both literally and figuratively.
And it's a fear that still resonates today, don't you think? Even though we've mapped the oceans, explored the deepest trenches, we're still drawn to these stories, these images that remind us of just how small we are in the grand scheme of things.
We are. Because no matter how much we learn, how much we achieve, there's always going to be that element of the unknown, something bigger than ourselves, lurking just beyond our grasp. And maybe that's not a bad thing.
You know, it's funny how this conversation about a mythical sea monster keeps circling back to this idea of the unknown.
It makes sense when you think about it. Leviathan, it's this blank slate, this mirror reflecting our own fears and fascinations back at us. It makes us confront those big questions, the ones that don't have easy answers.
Questions about our place in the world, the nature of good and evil, the limits of our own understanding.
And that, I think, is the true legacy of Leviathan. It's not about whether it exists or not, but what it represents. That sense of wonder, that shiver down your spine when you realize just how vast and mysterious the universe really is.
It's a reminder that some mysteries, they're best left unsolved. That there's beauty in not knowing, in embracing that sense of awe and terror that comes with staring into the abyss.
Precisely. So the next time you're by the ocean, take a moment, listen to the waves, and remember there are still monsters out there.
But maybe, just maybe, the most fascinating monsters are the ones we carry within ourselves.
And on that note, I think it's time to surface from this deep dive.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and never stop looking for those hidden depths.